They say freedom has a price, but nobody tells you that sometimes the price is paid in blood and silence. In the spring of 1866, 347 formerly enslaved people walked into the town of Redemption, Georgia, with nothing but hope in their hearts and the clothes on their backs. By winter, not a single one remained. No bodies were ever found, no graves were ever marked, no questions were ever answered. For over a century, this town guarded its secret like a coiled snake guards its nest, until one woman dared to dig up the truth that America tried to bury. What she found didn't just shake the foundations of a small southern town, it revealed a horror so systematic, so deliberate, that it changed how we understand the true cost of emancipation. This is not just a ghost story. This is not just history. This is the town where they disappeared after emancipation, and if you think you know how dark America's past can be, you're about to discover you've only scratched the surface. Stay with me, because every word of what I'm about to tell you actually happened, and the implications will haunt you long after this story ends. The promise of redemption. The dirt road leading into Redemption, Georgia stretched like a ribbon of rust-colored hope through the pine forests of the Deep South. It was April 1866, barely a year after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, and the air itself seemed to tremble with the weight of change. Sarah Brennan stood at the front of the long procession of black families, her spine straight despite the 40-mile journey they'd just completed on foot. She was 23 years old, with eyes that had seen too much suffering for her years and hands that bore the permanent scars of cotton fields and cooking fires. In her arms, she carried her daughter, Clara, who was just shy of her second birthday. Behind Sarah walked 346 other souls, each one carrying their own story of bondage and survival. There was old Thomas, who claimed to be nearly 80, and had been born in chains in Virginia before being sold south 3 times. There was the Williamson family, parents and 7 children ranging from infant to teenager, all of whom had been split up during slavery and miraculously reunited in the chaos following the war. There was Reverend Abraham Porter, a self-taught preacher who had conducted secret prayer meetings in slave quarters across 3 counties, always one step ahead of the patrollers who would have whipped the skin from his back had they caught him. They had heard about redemption from a Freedmen's Bureau agent in Macon, a thin white man from Massachusetts with kind eyes and an earnest voice, who had told them that land was available, that a community could be built, that this was their chance to forge something real from the ashes of the old world. The town had been abandoned during Sherman's march to the sea, he explained, left as a skeleton of empty buildings and overgrown fields. The federal government, in its wisdom, had designated it as one of the experimental communities where formerly enslaved people could establish themselves as free citizens. 40 acres and a mule, the agent had said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that Sarah had noticed but chosen to ignore. Build something for yourselves. Show them what free black folks can accomplish. The promise had been intoxicating. After generations of working someone else's land, enriching someone else's family, breaking their backs for someone else's profit, they would finally have something of their own, a place where their children could grow up free, a place where they could vote, own property, build schools and churches, a place called redemption, which seemed to Sarah like a word chosen by God himself. As the procession crested the final hill, the town came into view, and Sarah felt her heart quicken. It was larger than she'd expected, with what looked like 50 or 60 buildings arranged around a central square. Most were in various states of disrepair, with broken windows and sagging porches, but they were structures nonetheless. Real buildings with real walls and real roofs. She could see what had once been a general store, a blacksmith shop, a building that might have been a schoolhouse. The church steeple still stood tall against the April sky, though the cross at its peak had fallen or been removed. Lord have mercy, old Thomas breathed beside her, his voice thick with emotion. Look at it, Sarah. Just look at it. But as they drew closer, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach tighten with unease. There were people already in the town. White people, perhaps 24 of them, standing in small clusters around the square, watching the approaching procession with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. They were rough-looking folks, dressed in clothes that had seen hard wear, several of the men openly carrying rifles. At the head of this welcoming committee stood a tall man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and a face like weathered leather. He wore the remnants of what might have once been a Confederate officer's uniform, though the insignia had been torn away. As Sarah and the others entered the square, he stepped forward, and the crowd behind him fell silent. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the square with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to command. "Looks like we got ourselves some new neighbors." Sarah stopped, and the procession behind her shuffled to a halt. She felt Clara stir in her arms, and she held her daughter closer. Reverend Porter moved up beside her, his presence a quiet source of strength. "Good afternoon," the Reverend said, his voice calm and measured. "My name is Abraham Porter, and these are my brothers and sisters in Christ. We've been sent here by the Freedmen's Bureau. We were told redemption was designated for settlement." The white man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Is that so? And I'm Colonel Harrison Wade, though I suppose I'm just Mr. Wade these days, seeing as how we lost the war and all." He said these last words with a bitterness that hung in the air like smoke. "Funny thing out that. See, this is my town. Always has been. My granddaddy founded Redemption back in 1823, built every one of these buildings with his own hands and the hands of folks who worked for him." "Worked for him?" Sarah heard herself say, the words coming out before she could stop them. "You mean enslaved by him?" Wade's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment she saw something dangerous flash across his face. But when he spoke, his voice remained deceptively mild. "I mean what I said, girl. Now, I don't know what promises some Yankee carpetbagger made you folks up in Macon, but here's the truth of it. This land belongs to the Wade family. It belonged to us before the war, and it belongs to us now. Federal government's got no right to give away what ain't theirs to give." "The Emancipation Proclamation freed us," Reverend Porter said quietly. "The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The law, Wade interrupted, is whatever we say it is. You're a long way from Washington, preacher. You're a long way from any federal troops. You're in Redemption now, and in Redemption things work a certain way." Sarah felt the crowd behind her stirring, heard the murmur of worried voices. They had walked 40 miles. They had left behind the only homes they'd ever known, even if those homes had been slave quarters. They had pinned everything on this promise of land and freedom. And now this man stood before them, telling them it had all been for nothing. But before anyone could respond, a young white woman pushed through the crowd behind Wade. She couldn't have been more than 19, with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that might have been pretty if... OT for the hardness around her eyes. "Daddy," she said, touching Wade's arm. "Maybe we ought to let them stay." Wade turned to her, his eyebrows raised. "Josephine, just hear me out," she continued, speaking quickly. "We've got all these fields lying fallow, and you've been saying yourself we need workers for the harvest. These folks are here. They're willing to work. Why not put them to use?" Sarah felt a chill run through her at the way Josephine said put them to use, as if they were tools rather than people. But Wade was nodding slowly, a calculating expression on his face. "The girl's got a point," he said, stroking his chin. "Tell you what, preacher. You and your people can stay. Temporarily. There's empty cabins on the east side of town where the quarters used to be. You can settle in there, and seeing as how you'll be needing food and supplies, and seeing as how the only store in 20 miles is the one I run, I expect you'll be working off your debt to me. Fair wages, of course. This ain't slavery anymore. This is business." "What kind of wages?" asked a voice from the crowd. It was Jacob Williamson, father of 7, a man who had been promised 40 acres and a mule. Wade smiled again. "Why, the fair kind. $3 a month plus room and board. You work my fields, I keep you fed and housed. Simple as that. $3? Sarah couldn't keep the shock from her voice. Even in slavery times she'd heard of skilled workers being hired out for more than that. "Sir, that's what's on offer," Wade said, his voice hardening. "You're welcome to take it or leave it, but if you leave it, you'll need to be leaving Redemption too." "Because I said, this is my town, and I don't take kindly to trespassers." Sarah looked around at the faces of her people. She saw fear there, and exhaustion, and the beginning of despair. They had nowhere else to go. The Freedmen's Bureau agent had given them directions to Redemption but no alternatives. They had no money, no provisions beyond what they'd carried with them. Winter was still months away, but spring planting had already begun. If they were going to eat, they needed to work. Reverend Porter must have seen the same thing in those faces, because he nodded slowly. "We'll stay," he said, "for now, but we'll be writing to the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll be making sure that our legal rights—" "You do that," Wade interrupted, chuckling. "You write all the letters you want, preacher. Won't make no difference. But you're welcome to try." And so they stayed. The 347 freedmen and freedwomen who had walked into Redemption, Georgia that April day moved into the old slave quarters on the east side of town. The cabins were in terrible condition, with roofs that leaked and walls that let in the wind, but they were shelter. Sarah claimed a small one-room structure for herself and Clara, sharing it with an elderly woman named May, who had been a house servant on a plantation near Atlanta. That first night, Sarah lay on the bare wooden floor with Clara sleeping beside her, and she listened to the sounds of the town settling in around her. She heard babies crying and mothers singing soft lullabies. She heard old Thomas coughing in the cabin next door, the same cough that had plagued him for months. She heard Reverend Porter's voice drifting through the door, Kness, as he led a prayer meeting, asking God for guidance and protection. And underneath it all, she heard something else, something that made her skin prickle with instinctive dread. It was the sound of laughter coming from the white part of town. Hard laughter, the kind that celebrated someone else's misfortune, the kind that said the joke wasn't over yet. Sarah pulled Clara closer and closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. The days that followed established a pattern that felt sickeningly familiar to anyone who had lived through slavery. They woke before dawn to the sound of a bell that Wade's foreman rang in the town square. They ate a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and weak coffee. Then they walked to the fields, where they worked from sunup to sundown, planting cotton and corn and tobacco under the watchful eyes of white overseers who carried whips they didn't hesitate to use. "This is sharecropping," Reverend Porter explained to Sarah one evening as they sat outside their cabins, too exhausted to do anything but rest. "They're calling it freedom, but it's just slavery by another name. We work the land, they take the profit, and at the end of the year they tell us we still owe them money for food and shelter and supplies." "Can't we leave?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Where would we go? We've got no money saved. Anyone who tries to leave, Wade's boys catch them on the road and bring them back. They call them deserters, say they're stealing because they owe debts, and the law, such as it is around here, backs him up." Sarah looked down at her hands, calloused and scarred from years of labor. "This isn't what I wanted for Claire." She said softly. "I wanted her to grow up free, really free." "She is free," Porter said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The 13th Amendment, words on paper," Sarah interrupted. "That's all it is. Words on paper, and we're still in the fields, and Clara's still growing up watching her mama break her back for white folks who don't see us as human." That night, Sarah made a decision. She would start keeping a record. She found a stub of pencil that someone had discarded and began writing in the margins of an old newspaper that had been used to line one of the cabin walls. She wrote down the number of hours they worked each day. She wrote down the wages they were promised versus what they actually received. She wrote down every injustice, every broken promise, every instance of violence or cruelty. She didn't know what she would do with these records, but somehow it felt important to document what was happening, to create proof that they had been here, that they had tried, that they had not simply accepted their fate without resistance. Summer arrived with suffocating heat and humidity that turned the air thick as syrup. The work in the fields became almost unbearable. Several of the older people collapsed from exhaustion or heat stroke. One of them, a man named Silas who claimed to have been nearly 70, died in the fields on a Tuesday morning in July. They buried him in an unmarked grave on the edge of town because Wade refused to let them use the white cemetery, and they had no money for a proper stone. It was at Silas's funeral that Sarah first noticed them watching. She was standing at the graveside, listening to Reverend Porter deliver a eulogy. And she felt eyes on her. She looked up and saw a group of white men standing on the ridge above the burial ground. There were 7 of them, all on horseback, silhouetted against the evening sky. They weren't doing anything, just watching, but there was something about their stillness, their patience, that filled Sarah with a dread she couldn't name. "Who are they?" she whispered to May, who stood beside her holding Clara. May followed her gaze and her face went ashen. "Night riders," she breathed. "Lord Jesus, protect us." "Night riders, men who ride after dark," May explained, her voice barely audible. "Wearing hoods and carrying torches. They say they're keeping order, but what they really do is terrorize black folks who step out of line. Burn houses, whip people. Worse." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She had heard rumors of such groups forming across the South, former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers who couldn't accept the new order and were determined to keep black people subjugated through fear and violence. But she had told herself that surely the federal government wouldn't allow such things. Surely there were laws, protections, consequences. "Have they come here?" she asked. "To redemption?" May didn't answer, but the look in her eyes was answer enough. That night Sarah barely slept. Every sound made her jump, the wind in the trees, a dog barking in the distance, the creak of settling wood. She kept Clara close, one hand resting on her daughter's chest to feel the reassuring rise and fall of her breathing. And she thought about the men on the ridge, watching them bury their dead, marking them like predators mark prey. The next morning, 3 of T. He families announced they were leaving. They packed what few possessions they had and started walking north, toward Atlanta, hoping to find work there, or perhaps passage further north, to places where freedom might mean something more than a word on paper. Wade's men caught them 6 miles down the road. They brought them back in chains, literally, with iron shackles around their ankles. The families were forced to stand in the town square while Wade addressed the assembled community. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "You people owe me money. Money for housing, for food, for the supplies I've generously provided. You can't just walk away from your debts. That's theft. That's a crime, and crimes have consequences." The men were whipped, 20 lashes each, administered in front of their wives and children. The screams echoed off the buildings and seemed to hang in the air long after the punishment was complete. Then Wade announced that their debt had been increased to cover the cost of pursuing them, and that they would be working double shifts until it was paid off. "Course," Wade added, almost as an afterthought. "If anyone else is thinking about running, well, the punishment will be worse. A lot worse. The law's on my side, you see. I got papers showing what you owe me. I got the sheriff in the next county on my payroll, and I got friends who don't take kindly to thieves and deserters." After that, no one tried to leave. August brought something worse than the heat and the endless labor. It brought sickness. It started with the children, a fever that swept through the cabins, leaving small bodies burning with heat and thing with convulsions. Clara caught it on a Wednesday, and by Thursday evening her temperature was so high that Sarah could barely touch her skin without flinching. "Please," Sarah begged Wade, kneeling in front of his house with Clara limp in her arms. "Please, she needs a doctor. She needs medicine." Wade looked down at her from his porch, sipping whiskey from a crystal glass. "Doctor costs money," he said. "You got any money?" "No, but I'll work it off. Double shifts, triple shifts, whatever you want. Just please help her." Wade considered this, swirling his whiskey. "Tell you what," he said finally. "There's a doctor over in Valdosta, about 30 miles east. You can go fetch him if you want, but that's going to put you another $20 in debt. 10 for the doctor's fee, 10 for the time you'll miss working. And if the girl dies anyway, well, you'll still owe me." Sarah stared at him, unable to comprehend such casual cruelty. But what choice did she have? She agreed to his terms, laid Clara in May's trembling arms, and started running. She ran through the night, following the road east by moonlight. Her feet blistered and bled, her lungs burned. But she kept running, because Clara's life depended on it. She reached Valdosta just after dawn, found the doctor's house, and pounded on his door until he answered. The doctor was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who listened to her story and agreed to come, though his face darkened when she mentioned redemption. "That town's got a bad reputation," he said as he hitched his horse to his buggy. "I've heard stories." "What kind of stories?" Sarah asked, climbing up beside him. But the doctor just shook his head. Daughter Hannah disappeared between the fields and the cabins, a walk that should have taken 10 minutes in broad daylight. One minute they were there, the next they weren't, as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. The disappearances came faster after that. A man here, a family there. always at dusk or dawn, always on the edges of town where the forest pressed close. People stopped going anywhere alone. They traveled in groups, carrying whatever weapons they could improvise: kitchen knives, heavy sticks, tools from the blacksmith shop. But it didn't seem to matter. The disappearances continued. By September, 23 people were gone. Sarah kept count in her hidden records, writing each name with a hand that shook with fury and fear. She wrote down everything she could remember about them: their faces, their voices, their dreams for the future. She felt it was important that someone remember, that someone bear witness, even if she didn't know what good it would do. One evening in late September, Reverend Porter called a meeting in what had once been the church. Nearly the entire community crowded inside, 324 souls who remained out of the original 347. "We cannot stay here," Porter said, his voice ringing through the rafters. "Whatever is happening, whether it's night riders or something worse, we cannot simply wait to be picked off one by one. We need to leave. All of us together. Safety in numbers. Wade will send his men after us," someone called out. "He did before." "Then we split up," said Jacob Williamson. "Some go north, some go south, some go east and west. They can't chase all of us. Some us will make it to the next town, to the Freedmen's Bureau, to federal troops. We can tell them what's happening here." There was murmuring as people considered this. It was risky, perhaps even suicidal, but staying seemed just as dangerous. Sarah stood up, Clara on her hip. "I say we try," she said. "Even if only some of us make it, at least we tried. At least we didn't just accept this." Others nodded in agreement. The vote was nearly unanimous. They would leave in 3 days, giving them time to prepare, to gather what supplies they could steal or barter, to choose their routes and plan their escape. They should have left that very night. Because on the second night, as they huddled in their cabins making their final preparations, they heard the horses, dozens of them, thundering into town from all directions. And they heard the shouts of men, rough voices calling orders. And they saw the torches, creating a ring of fire around the eastern quarter where the cabins stood. Sarah grabbed Clara and ran to the window. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. There must have been 50 men on horseback, maybe more, circling the cabins like wolves around a fold of sheep. They wore hoods, white hoods that covered their faces, with holes cut out for eyes. They carried rifles and torches and lengths of rope. And at their head, on a massive black horse, was a figure she recognized by his bearing and his voice even through the hood: Harrison Wade. "Come out," he called, his voice booming across the night. "Every last one of you. Come out now, or we burn the cabins with you inside." People began stumbling out of the cabins, terrified, clutching their children. Sarah joined them, holding Clara tight, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. They were herded into the center of the compound, surrounded by the circle of mounted men and their blazing torches. Wade dismounted and pulled off his hood. There was no point in hiding now, his expression said. No witnesses would survive to report what they had seen. "You people have disappointed me," he said, shaking his head with mock sadness. "I gave you a chance. I gave you work, shelter, food, and how do you repay me? By plotting to steal from me, to run off without paying your debts, to abandon the contracts you signed." "We signed nothing," Reverend Porter shouted. "You enslaved us in everything but name." Wade walked up to Porter and struck him across the face with the back of his hand, a blow so hard it knocked the preacher to his knees. "You'll speak when spoken to," Wade said softly. Then he raised his voice again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay your debts, all of them, every penny. And since you clearly can't be trusted to do that through labor, we're going to collect another way." He gestured to his men, and they began pulling people from the crowd, the strongest men, the healthiest women, the oldest children. Sarah watched in horror as families were torn apart, as husbands were separated from wives and children from parents. "These folks are being sold," Wade announced. "There's still a market for labor, see, even if we can't legally call it slavery anymore. There's prisons that need workers. There's plantations in Texas and Louisiana that ain't too particular about where their help comes from. They'll pay good money, and that money will settle your debt. Tease, you can't do this." Someone screamed. "Slavery is illegal. The 13th Amendment says nothing about lawful imprisonment," Wade interrupted. "And every one of you is guilty of theft and breach of contract. I got the papers to prove it, and I got the sheriff to enforce it. It's all perfectly legal, I assure you." That was when the true horror began. The people who had been selected were chained together and led away to waiting wagons. Their screams and pleas echoed through the night, but there was nothing anyone could do. The men with guns surrounded the remaining crowd, making sure no one tried to resist or escape. Sarah found herself praying that she wouldn't be chosen, that she could keep Clara, even as she felt sick with guilt for the thought. But Wade's eyes passed over her, perhaps because she was holding a small child, perhaps because some tiny shred of conscience still flickered in his blackened soul. 73 people were taken that night, loaded into wagons and driven away into the darkness, to fates that Sarah could only imagine with growing dread. As the last wagon disappeared down the road, and the mounted men finally dispersed, Sarah looked around at what remained of their community. 251 people, hollow-eyed with shock and trauma, standing in the ruins of their hopes. Reverend Porter climbed slowly to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. "We have to go," he said. "Tonight. Now. Before they come back." But Wade had thought of that. As people began hurrying to their cabins to gather their things, they discovered that the cabins had been locked from the outside. Heavy chains and padlocks secured every door. The Y were trapped in their own quarters. "Let this be a lesson," Wade's voice called from the darkness. "You work for me until your debts are paid. You try to run, and the next time won't be a sale. The next time will be a burning, every last one of you." Sarah sank to the ground, Clara crying in her arms, and she looked up at the stars scattered across the night sky. They seemed impossibly distant, impossibly cold, offering no comfort and no answers. That was the moment she understood the full truth of their situation. They hadn't escaped slavery after all. They had simply traded one master for another, one form of bondage for another. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed them on paper, but here in Redemption, Georgia, in this forgotten corner of the South, paper meant nothing. Here they were still slaves in everything but name, and the worst was yet to come, the harvest of souls. October arrived with cooler temperatures and a creeping sense of doom that hung over the remaining residents of Redemption like morning fog. Sarah marked the passage of days in her hidden record, which had grown into a detailed chronicle of horrors. She had taken to writing at night by the dim light of a smuggled candle, documenting every disappearance, every act of cruelty, every broken promise. She knew it was dangerous. If Wade or his men found her writings, the consequences would be severe, but she felt compelled to continue. Someone had to remember. Someone had to tell the truth about what was happening in this place. The number of residents had dwindled to 251 after the night of the forced sales, but the disappearances hadn't stopped. They continued. Relentless. As the changing seasons. A young couple named James and Esther vanished from their cabin in the middle of the night, leaving behind their 3-year-old son crying in his bed. An elderly man named Moses went to draw water from the well one morning and never returned, though his bucket was found overturned beside it, water soaking into the dirt. What made these disappearances particularly terrifying was that they seemed to follow no pattern. Young and old, men and women, the strong and the weak, whoever was taking them didn't discriminate. It was as if Redemption itself had developed an appetite for human lives, and it fed indiscriminately. May, who shared Sarah's cabin, had become increasingly withdrawn, jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers even when they were alone. "It's not natural," she muttered one evening as they prepared their meager dinner of beans and cornbread. "The way people just vanish. No bodies, no traces. Like they never existed." "Someone's taking them," Sarah said firmly, trying to cling to rational explanations even as her own faith in them wavered. "Wade and his night riders. They're either killing people or selling them off, and they're disposing of the bodies somewhere we can't find them." But even as she said it, she remembered the cases where people had vanished in broad daylight, in the middle of open spaces, with others nearby who should have heard something, seen something. She remembered Hannah and Bethany who had disappeared on the short walk between the fields and the cabins, a path that dozens of other people were traveling at the same time. How could anyone have taken them without being seen? May looked at her with haunted eye. "You don't believe that any more than I do," she said softly. "There's something wrong with this place, Sarah. something that goes deeper than Wade and his men. This town is cursed. Sarah wanted to argue but found she couldn't, because in her heart she was beginning to believe the same thing. The next day brought a new development that would prove to be the beginning of the end. A young man named Elijah, who worked in the blacksmith shop repairing tools and equipment, came running to Reverend Porter's cabin in the middle of the afternoon, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Reverend," he panted, "I found something. In the old church. You need to see this." Porter followed him, and word spread quickly through the community. Soon a small crowd had gathered at the abandoned church building that stood at the edge of the white part of town. It had been locked and boarded up since their arrival, but Elijah had discovered that one of the boards had rotted away, leaving a gap just wide enough for a thin person to squeeze through. "I was looking for timber to patch my cabin roof," Elijah explained as he led them inside. "I figured nobody was using this old place, so maybe I could take a few boards. But when I got inside, I found these." The interior of the church was dim and musty, with shafts of light streaming through gaps in the walls. But even in the dimness, they could see what Elijah was pointing to. The walls were covered in writing, hundreds of names, scratched and carved and written in what looked like charcoal and chalk and dried blood. Sarah moved closer, her heart pounding. The names were black names, first and last, some with dates beside them. She recognized several: Daniel Morris, the young man who had disappeared months ago, Bethany and Hannah Wilson, James and Esther Coleman, and dozens of others, names she didn't recognize but that must have belonged to people who had come to redemption before them. "Lord have mercy," Reverend Porter breathed. "This is a record." Someone was keeping track. "Of what?" asked Jacob Williamson, though they all knew the answer. "Of everyone who disappeared," Sarah said, running her fingers over the carved names. "Going back years by the look of it. This isn't the first time Wade has done this. There have been others before us. At the far end of the church, beneath the dusty remnants of what had once been an altar, they found a wooden crate. Inside were ledgers, the kind merchants used to track inventory and sales." Porter opened one with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "July 1865. 15 souls, sold to Garrison Plantation, Louisiana. Price, $800. He looked up, his face ashen. "There are entries going back to April 1865, right after the war ended, right after Emancipation." Sarah took another ledger and flipped through its pages. The entries were meticulously detailed: names, dates, prices, destinations. Some people were sold to plantations. Others were sold to mining operations or railroad companies or timber camps. And then there were entries that simply said disposed of with a date and number. "Disposed of," Sarah read aloud, her voice hollow. "What does that mean?" No one wanted to answer, but they all understood. Some people weren't valuable enough to sell. Some people were too old, too sick, too rebellious. Those people simply disappear. And no one ever saw them again. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, they found a journal. It was written in an educated hand, and it was signed by someone named Jeremiah Wade, Harrison Wade's father. Reverend Porter read aloud from the journal as the gathered crowd listened in horrified silence. It told a story of systematic exploitation and murder that had been going on for over a year, since the very end of the Civil War. Jeremiah Wade had been a plantation owner who lost his fortune when the Confederacy fell. His slaves were freed, his fields lay fallow, and his family faced the prospect of poverty. But Jeremiah was clever and ruthless, and he had seen an opportunity in the chaos of Reconstruction. He had spread word through the Freedmen's Bureau network that land was available in Redemption, Georgia. Formerly enslaved people, desperate for a new start, came in waves. Jeremiah welcomed them, put them to work, and told them they were accumulating debts for food and shelter and supplies. When they tried to leave, he had them arrested as thieves and contract breakers. Some he sold to plantations and work camps that were willing to pay for labor and not ask too many questions about where it came from. Others, the elderly, the sick, the rebellious, he had murdered and buried in unmarked graves in the forests surrounding Redemption. It was a perfect system, the journal explained with chilling pride. Free labor that generated profit through both their work and their eventual sale. And because Redemption was isolated, because it had no federal troops stationed nearby, because the local sheriff was on the Wade payroll, No one ever investigated. The freedmen who arrived in redemption simply disappeared from the world, and no one came looking for them. "We're not the first," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "How many came before us?" Porter flipped to the back of the journal, where Jeremiah had kept running tallies. According to this, more than 800 people came to redemption between April 1865 and March 1866, when Jeremiah died. "And how many left?" Jacob asked. Porter was silent for a long moment, his finger tracing down columns of numbers. "None," he said finally. "According to this, not a single person left redemption alive. They were all either sold or killed." The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. 800 people, all the joy and hope of emancipation, twisted into a nightmare of continued bondage and death. And now they were living the same nightmare, walking the same path that had led hundreds before them to slavery or the grave. "We have to get this information out," Sarah said urgently. "This is proof, evidence. If we can get it to the Freedmen's Bureau, to federal authorities, they'll have to act. They'll have to stop Wade." "How?" someone asked. "We're locked in at night, watched during the day. Anyone who tries to leave gets hunted down." "Then we create a distraction," said Elijah. "Something big enough that some of us can slip away in the chaos." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. It was risky, dangerous, likely to fail. But what choice did they have? Stay and die slowly, or risk everything for a chance at freedom and justice? They decided to act on Sunday night. The white folks of redemption had a tradition of gathering for a social on Sunday evenings, complete with music and dancing and heavy drinking. It was the one time when Wade's vigilance relaxed, when the guards weren't quite as attentive. During the chaos of a deliberately started fire in the white part of town, a small group would make a run for it, carrying the ledgers and journal as evidence. Sarah volunteered to be part of the group. She knew it meant leaving Clara behind with May, knew that if she was caught or killed, her daughter would grow up without a mother. But she also knew that if she did nothing, Clara would grow up in bondage, or she wouldn't grow up at all. This was her chance to give her daughter a real future. The days until Sunday crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah held Clara every moment she could, memorizing her daughter's face, her laugh, the way she said "Mama" in her high, clear voice. She wrote a letter that she gave to May, instructions for how to care for Clara if Sarah didn't come back. She added a final entry to her hidden chronicle, explaining what they were about to attempt and why. Sunday arrived cold and clear. Sarah went through the motions of work in the fields, her mind focused on the coming night. As the sun set and the white folks began gathering for their social, she could hear fiddle music drifting across town, punctuated by laughter and the clink of bottles. At midnight, when the party was in full swing and Wade's men were deep in their cups, Elijah crept to the storage shed where lamp oil was kept. He filled several containers, then moved silently through the white part of town, splashing oil on the sides of buildings. When he reached Wade's general store, the building farthest from the slave quarters and clothes, to the forest, he set it ablaze. The fire caught faster than anyone expected, racing up the oil-soaked walls and leaping to the roof. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed in flames that lit up the night sky like a second sun. Shouts of alarm rang out from the social. Men came running with buckets, trying to form a line to the well. In the chaos and confusion, no one noticed the 4 figures slipping away into the darkness at the edge of town. Sarah ran through the forest, the ledgers and journal clutched to her chest, Reverend Porter beside her and 2 young men named Caleb and Thomas behind. They had studied the roads during their time in redemption, had memorized the path that would take them east to Valdosta, where federal troops were supposedly stationed. If they could just reach Valdosta, if they could just get this evidence into the right hands, maybe it would make a difference. Maybe it would save the 247 people still trapped in redemption. They ran for what felt like hours, stumbling through the darkness, using the stars to navigate. Behind them, the glow of the fire faded into the distance. Sarah's lungs burned and her legs ached, but she pushed herself harder, driven by desperation and hope. They were 10 miles from redemption when they heard the horses. The sound started as a distant rumble, like thunder on the horizon, but it grew louder, closer, until there was no mistaking it. Riders coming fast, hunting them down. "Split up," Porter gasped. Sarah, You take the evidence and keep going east. We'll lead them away." "No," Sarah protested, but Porter was already pushing her off the road and into the deeper forest. "For Clara," he shouted. "Run." Sarah ran. She heard shouting behind her, the crack of gunfire, screams that were abruptly cut off. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. She had to keep moving, had to get to Valdosta, had to make their sacrifice mean something. She ran until her legs gave out, until she collapsed in a ravine and lay there gasping for breath, her whole body shaking. She waited for the sound of pursuit, but heard nothing except the wind in the trees and the pounding of her own heart. As dawn broke gray and cold over the forest, Sarah climbed out of the ravine and kept moving east. She was alone now, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the precious ledgers wrapped in her shawl. She had no food, no water, no weapons. But she had evidence, and she had purpose. It took her 2 more days to reach Valdosta, 2 days of hiding during the daylight hours and moving at night, of drinking from streams and eating berries that made her stomach cramp. She arrived at the town looking like a ghost, hollow-eyed and filthy, barely able to stand. The federal troops were headquartered in a building that had once been a hotel. Sarah stumbled up the steps and through the door, where a young soldier in blue uniform looked at her with alarm. "I need to see the commanding officer," she managed to say before her legs gave out and she collapsed on the floor. When she woke, she was lying on a cot in a back room, a doctor leaning over her checking her pulse. The ledgers and journal were gone and panic seized her. "The books," she gasped, trying to sit up. "I had books, evidence." "Easy now," the doctor said gently, pressing her back down. "The books are with the company. Lonel. He's looking at them now." A few minutes later, a tall man in an officer's uniform entered the room. He had kind eyes but a hard set to his jaw, and he carried Jeremiah Wade's journal in one hand. "I'm Colonel William Sherman, no relation to the general," he said, pulling up a chair beside her cot. "I've read through some of what you brought. Tell me everything." So Sarah told him. She told him about the promises that brought them to redemption, about the impossible debts and the forced labor, about the disappearances and the night of the forced sales. She told him about finding the records in the church, about the 800 people who had come before them and vanished without a trace. She told him about Reverend Porter and Caleb and Thomas, who had sacrificed themselves so she could escape. When she finished, the colonel was silent for a long moment, his face grim. Finally he spoke. "This is worse than I imagined," he said. "We've heard rumors, of course. Reports of black folks going missing across Georgia and the Carolinas. But nothing on this scale, nothing this organized. You have to send troops," Sarah pleaded. "There are still nearly 250 people trapped in redemption. Wade is holding them prisoner. He's selling them like property. You have to save them." "I will," the colonel promised. "I'm sending a company out first thing in the morning. We'll arrest Wade and anyone else involved. We'll free your people and bring them somewhere safe." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and exhaustion and grief for all that had been lost. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." But there was something in the colonel's expression, a shadow that made her stomach clench with dread. "What is it?" she asked. "What aren't you telling me?" The colonel hesitated, then said quietly, "Miss Brennan, I have to be honest with you. Even with this evidence, even with federal troops, getting justice will be difficult. The courts are still controlled by local judges, many of them Confederate sympathizers. Wade has money and connections. And the people he sold, tracking them down, proving what happened to them, getting them back, it could take years. If it's even possible," Sarah felt her hope crumbling. "But you have proof," she said desperately. "The ledgers show everything. The sales, the murders, all of it." "We have Wade's father's records," the colonel corrected gently. "And Jeremiah Wade is dead. His son will claim he knew nothing about it, that he was just trying to run a legitimate business. He'll say the disappearances were people running off, breaking their contracts. He'll say the sales were lawful arrests of debtors, and in the current climate, with Reconstruction hanging by a thread and the federal government's commitment to protecting freedmen already wavering, I can't guarantee justice, Miss Brennan. I wish I could, but I can't." Sarah lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling, feeling the full weight of what the colonel was telling her. They might free the people still in redemption, but they might not be able to punish the men who had enslaved and murdered hundreds. The truth might never be fully acknowledged. The dead might never receive justice. But even so, she had to try. Because the alternative, giving up, accepting that those lives meant nothing, was unbearable. The next morning, Colonel Sherman led a company of 40 soldiers toward Redemption. Sarah insisted on going with them despite the doctor's protests, refusing to rest while Clara and the others remained in danger. They rode hard, covering in half a day what had taken Sarah 2 days on foot. They arrived at Redemption in the late afternoon, and what they found made even the hardened soldiers fall silent in shock. The town was empty, not just empty of people, empty of evidence that people had ever been there at all. The cabins where Sarah had lived, where nearly 250 souls had been imprisoned just days ago, were gone, burned to ash and foundations. The fields they had worked showed no signs of recent cultivation. The church where they had found the damning records was nothing but charred timbers, and there was no sign of Harrison Wade or his men, no sign of any white residents, no sign of the nearly 250 black folks who should have been there. They had all vanished, as completely as if they had never existed. "Dear God," Colonel Sherman breathed, surveying the devastation. "How is this possible? How could they move that many people, destroy this much evidence, in just 3 days?" Sarah walked through the ruins in a daze, searching for some sign of Clara, of May, of anyone she knew. She found nothing. No bodies, no belongings, no traces. Just ashes and silence. The soldiers spread out, searching the surrounding forest, looking for graves or hiding places, or any clue to where the missing people might have gone. They found nothing. It was as if 250 people had simply been erased from existence. As night fell, Sarah stood in the ruins of what had been her cabin, holding the doorframe that was all that remained. She thought about Clara, about holding her daughter one last time before she ran into the forest. She thought about May and old Thomas and all the others whose names she had carefully recorded in her chronicle. She thought about 800 people, maybe more, who had come to Redemption seeking freedom and found only death or bondage. "We'll keep searching," Colonel Sherman said, standing beside her. "We'll interview people in the surrounding towns, track down the sales, find out where Wade went. We won't stop until we have answers." But Sarah knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like ice, that they would never find those answers. Redemption had swallowed up hundreds of people over the course of more than a year, and it had done so without leaving traces that anyone could follow. Whatever system Wade and his Confederates had built, it was too efficient, too well established, for a single raid by federal troops to dismantle. The colonel kept his word. For months his soldiers searched. They interviewed residents of nearby towns, but everyone claimed to know nothing about Redemption or the disappearances. They tried to track the sales recorded in Jeremiah Wade's ledgers, but most led to dead ends. Plantations that no longer existed, companies that had gone out of business, individuals who had died or disappeared themselves. They found Harrison Wade 6 months later, living under an assumed name in Alabama and running a sawmill that employed what he claimed were voluntary workers. He denied everything. Claimed he'd sold his property in Redemption and left Georgia months before Sarah and her people arrived. Claimed he'd never held anyone against their will, never sold anyone, never murdered anyone. And without physical evidence, without witnesses willing to testify, without bodies or surviving victims, the authorities couldn't prove otherwise. Wade was eventually arrested and tried, but the trial was a farce. The jury was all white, all sympathetic to the lost cause. The judge was a former Confederate officer. Wade's lawyers painted Sarah as a liar and troublemaker, questioned her intelligence and reliability. The ledgers and journal were dismissed as forgeries or as the ravings of Wade's deceased father, which the son couldn't be held responsible for. Harrison Wade was acquitted of all charges and walked out of the courthouse a free man. Sarah attended the trial every day, sitting in the colored section of the courtroom, forcing herself to look at Wade's smug face, to listen to the lies and the legal manipulations. When the verdict was read, she felt something break inside her, some last fragile hope that justice was possible in this world. She lived for another 43 years after that, settling eventually in Atlanta, working as a washerwoman and then as a teacher in a school for black children. She never saw Clara again, never learned what happened to her daughter or to any of the other people from Redemption. She kept her chronicle hidden for decades, afraid to share it, afraid that Wade or his allies might come for her if they knew she still had evidence. She died in 1909 at the age of 66, and her chronicle passed to her niece, who didn't know what to make of it and stored it in an attic trunk with other family pep. It stayed there for 97 years, forgotten, gathering dust, the names and dates and horrors documented within slowly fading into illegibility. In 2006, a historian named Dr. Maya Richardson was researching Reconstruction-era Georgia for her dissertation when she came across a brief mention of redemption in a collection of Friedman's bureau letters. The reference was vague, something about a settlement that had been established and then abandoned under mysterious circumstances. Intrigued, Dr. Richardson began digging deeper. She found the court records from Harrison Wade's trial, which had been misfiled and forgotten in a county courthouse basement. She found census records that showed significant discrepancies in black population numbers in that region of Georgia between 1865 and 1870, with hundreds of people seemingly vanishing from the records. She found scattered references in newspapers and letters to rumors of disappearances, though no one had ever investigated seriously. And then she found Sarah's chronicle, offered for sale at an estate auction in Atlanta. The niece who had stored it had died, and her grandchildren were clearing out the house. They had no idea what the old, water-stained pages covered in fading ink represented. Dr. Richardson purchased it for $50 and spent the next 6 months carefully transcribing and verifying its contents. What she discovered shook the historical community. Here was direct first-hand testimony of systematic re-enslavement and murder of freedmen in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Here were names and dates and details that could be cross-referenced with other records. Here was proof that the mises of emancipation had been perverted into new forms of bondage, that freedom had been stolen from hundreds or thousands of people who had dared to hope for something better. Dr. Richardson published her findings in 2008, and the story of redemption. Georgia finally entered the historical record more than 140 years after the events had occurred. Her book, The Town Where They Disappeared, Redemption and the Failed Promise of Freedom, became a bestseller and won several prestigious awards. It sparked a national conversation about Reconstruction, about the ways that the legacy of slavery persisted long after legal emancipation, about the horrors that had been committed and then buried. In 2010, a team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists traveled to the site where redemption had stood. The town had long since vanished, reclaimed by forest, with no visible signs that it had ever existed. But using ground-penetrating radar and Sarah's detailed descriptions of locations, they began to search. What they found in the forest surrounding the former town site still haunts those who were there to witness it. Mass graves, dozens of them, containing the remains of hundreds of people, men, women, children. The bones told stories of violence, skulls with bullet holes, ribs with knife marks, wrist bones showing signs of having been shackled. Carbon dating and other analysis confirmed that most of the remains dated from 1865 to 1866. The exact number of bodies recovered is still uncertain because the remains are fragmentary and commingled, but current estimates suggest at least 400 individuals were buried in those graves. 400 people who came to Redemptio, seeking freedom, and instead found death. The site where redemption once stood is now a memorial park. A granite wall bears the names from Sarah's chronicle, each one carved deep into the stone so they can never be erased again. Interpretive signs explain what happened there, why it matters, how it fits into the larger story of Reconstruction and the long struggle for genuine freedom and equality. Every year on April 15th, the approximate date when the first freedmen arrived in redemption in 1866, descendants of survivors and supporters gather at the memorial to remember. They read the names aloud, all of them, speaking each name clearly so the people who were disappeared are made present again, if only for a moment. Sarah's chronicle itself is housed in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., displayed in a climate-controlled case where millions of visitors have gazed upon her careful handwriting, her meticulous records, her testament to horror and survival. Beside it is displayed the only known photograph of Sarah Brennan, taken in 1895 when she was an elderly woman. Her eyes look directly at the camera, and in them you can see both profound sadness and unbreakable strength. Of Clara, Sarah's daughter, no trace was ever found. She was 2 years old when she was taken from the ruins of Redemption, and what became of her remains a mystery. Perhaps she was sold to a plantation and lived out her life in bondage. Perhaps she died young, another anonymous victim of the horrors of that place. Or perhaps, and this is the hope that some people cling to, she survived, was raised by someone else, lived a long life under a different name, never knowing the full story of her mother's courage and sacrifice. Harrison Wade died in 1893, wealthy and respected in his Alabama community. His crimes never officially acknowledged or punished. His descendants still live in the South, and some of them have publicly acknowledged their ancestors' actions and apologized, though apologies can never undo what was done or bring back the dead. The story of redemption reminds us that emancipation was not the end of the struggle, but merely the beginning. It reminds us that freedom on paper means nothing without the power to enforce it, the will to protect it, the courage to fight for it. It reminds us that horror can wear the face of law and order, that evil can operate in plain sight if society chooses to look away. Most importantly, it reminds us that the disappeared deserve to be remembered. Every name, every life, every dream that was stolen. Sarah Brennan spent her life ensuring that the people of Redemption would not be forgotten, and her chronicle continues that work more than a century after her death. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the importance of bearing witness, of documenting injustice, of speaking truth even when the world doesn't want to listen. It is a story about the price of freedom and the cost of silence. The town of Redemption, Georgia, no longer exists except as a memorial and a warning, but its story lives on, carried forward by historians and educators, by descendants and allies, by anyone who believes that the dead deserve justice even when they can no longer demand it themselves. And somewhere, in the eternal mystery of what comes after death, we might hope that Sarah Brennan knows her work mattered, that her sacrifice meant something, that the chronicles she kept in secret and fear eventually reached the world and told a truth that needed to be told. This is the town where they disappeared after emancipation. This is the horror that America tried to forget. And this is why we must never stop remembering, never stop demanding justice, never stop fighting to make the promise of freedom real for everyone. Because the moment we forget, the moment we stop caring about the disappeared and the silenced, is the moment we allow such horrors to happen again. Remember Redemption. Remember Sarah Brennan. Remember the 347 who walked into that town with hope in their hearts. Remember the hundreds who came before them and the hundreds who came after. Remember them all. And let their memory be a light that drives back the darkness, a truth that resists every attempt to bury it, a call to justice that echoes across the generations until, at last,